BC Premier David Eby is adamant that the tanker ban off the province's north coast must remain in place. The moratorium is among the 9 laws that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has been calling for the federal government to repeal or modify. Eby said today that repealing the ban would put BC projects in jeopardy.
Why would we remove the tanker ban? Why would we put the precious north coast at risk? The only possible answer would be because the Premier of Alberta woke up one morning and thought that that would be a good idea. She has no project. She has no company interested in building this. She has no money to build it. She has no route. She has nothing. My message to the federal government has been very straightforward. Do not lift the tanker ban.
This is Eby's latest pushback to Smith's pitch to get a bitumen pipeline built to the BC coast. Smith has been critical of Eby, calling his opposition to her plan un-Canadian and unconstitutional. Naheed Nenshi is the Alberta NDP leader. Welcome to the show. You have said that getting a pipeline built takes hard work. What does that hard work look like? And is it even possible at this point when you have the premiers of Alberta and BC talking at each other publicly?
Yeah, I had a front row seat to this in 2015 timeframe, and it's sad for me to see that we're rehashing sort of the pipeline politics and the tired arguments from that time. It's also important to note that we did, in fact, get a pipeline built. Alberta's new Democratic government, with an able assistant from the then mayor of Calgary, was able to get the Trans Mountain expansion done, the only pipeline to Tidewater that we've been able to build in generations. In fact, no Conservative government, including this one, that's been in power here in Alberta for 6 years, has managed to get a single mile of pipeline to Tidewater approved. So there is a way to do it, and it means rolling up your sleeves and doing the hard work. And the challenge that I've got is that Premier Danielle Smith kind of threw, as she always does, threw a grenade over the fence. And what did she think was going to happen? She hadn't talked to Premier Eby. They hadn't come to some sort of a bargain or even an agree to disagree. And, I argued a lot with Premier John Horgan back in the day about these things, but we got Trans Mountain built through a lot of hard work, a lot of consultation with landowners and Indigenous peoples, as well as with the federal and provincial governments. And we're just not seeing that from this Premier. I always say she prefers to fight than to win. She loves to pick fights. But on something so critical for Alberta's future, you'd think she would have been a little more thoughtful in her approach.
Now, I do think we need to point out, though, in terms of Trans Mountain, the tanker ban that is so at the center of this dispute right now was not really an issue for that pipeline. And it is for this pipeline, and that's exactly why you've got the BC Premier saying, do not get rid of that tanker ban, and you have the Alberta Premier saying, we want that tanker ban gone. So when you have that impasse, how do you move past that?
Well, I think if my memory is correct, the tanker ban on the north coast of British Columbia came in after the approval of the Trans Mountain expansion, sort of part of what was then maybe a grand bargain, which is a term we're hearing a lot lately. But the issue is that both my Premier and Premier Eby have zeroed in on this issue as something which is a hill to die on both sides. But in fact, what you need to do is have a much broader conversation. So we've seen with the Trans Mountain expansion that the Port of Vancouver, which is a very complicated urban port with tons of traffic, with tons of environmental sensitivities, has been able to produce and ship quite safely, very safely. And so the real question is, why don't we talk about how to keep the North Coast safe, which is something that every single person on every side of this argument agrees with. But instead, Premier Smith has boiled this down to a piece of policy, making it very hard for Premier Eby or the Prime Minister to step off of it. It's almost like she doesn't want this thing built, instead of looking at it as a broader context. Now, let's keep in mind that what Premier Smith has done here, I've been calling it a pipe dream rather than a pipeline. I believe very strongly, as Alberta's New Democrats have, that you can build export infrastructure for our most important export. You can create prosperity, and you can do so by being environmentally sensitive. What the Premier has announced is none of that. She's $14 million of taxpayers' money on a committee. There's no private proponent, there's no business case, there's no conversation with the buyers of the product, the eventual buyers of the product, to build volume or to pay for volume in advance on this pipeline. And certainly there is no consensus from Indigenous peoples or landowners along the route. Well, I shouldn't say that because there's no route. So for her to jump in this way, I guess she was trying to score some political points here instead of doing the hard work and then announcing something that a lot of people already agree with. Seems to me to be a particularly foolish way of going about this.
Now, they did say when they made the announcement that there was already calls had been made to Indigenous people and especially those along a possible route, I suppose. So I just want to, push back a little bit with that. There weren't those conversations.
It's worth actually settling on that for a second, Karina. I heard the chief of one of the coastal nations, it might even have been on this show, say when she was asked, did Premier Smith reach out to you? She said that the Indigenous Relations Minister phoned her the day before the announcement to tell her there was going to be an announcement. That is no way of doing consultation or working in an authentic, real way with Indigenous peoples. Again, it's putting their back up against the wall. So yeah, they made a few phone calls, but they didn't do so in a way of truly finding a win-win solution.
Now, you said that this puts not just EB in a difficult position in terms of putting the tanker ban as a hill to die on, but also the federal government. And we have heard from the federal energy minister, Tim Hodgson, who said during a Senate appearance last week that Alberta will need the support of the jurisdiction through which it plans to build this pipeline. How do you interpret the minister's comments in terms of Ottawa's intentions to perhaps intervene?
Well, he's clearly hedging, right? And Premier Smith has a point when she says constitutionally, this is for the federal government to decide. And certainly we saw that in the Trans Mountain expansion. I don't believe Premier Horgan ever came to terms with that, but he agreed that the courts and the federal government have the jurisdiction here. And so I was a little disappointed to hear that from Minister Hodgson. I think he's just hedging, but ultimately the federal government will have to make a decision. But I would prefer they made a decision on a real project, a project that has a proponent and has a route.
Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney was also talking about this last week because he was asked whether he would consider repealing the tanker ban or consider repealing the emissions cap. And at the time he said, it depends. And then he proceeded with an explanation of his government's goal of lowering emissions in numerous sectors, that part of the grand bargain. What does that signal to you?
Well, I think there really is a bargain to be made here. There's no one in Alberta, no matter how much of a proponent you are of pipelines, who wants environmental damage or who wants emissions to go way up. And there is an ability to do this. Right now, the biggest project here is one called Pathways, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, carbon capture and utilization projects in the world. But we have to be able to look at that in a net way. And I think one of the challenges with the previous federal government is that they sort of made these pronouncements without looking at the other end of the bargain, or without working with the stakeholders in the industry that provides so much prosperity for our country. Call me naive, but I think we can do it all. I think we can have environmental protection as well as economic prosperity coming from our most important natural resource.
So I don't have a lot of time left, but speaking of having it all, obviously we've been talking about a pipeline that goes to BC coastal waters, but we've now also heard about the possible resurrection of Keystone XL pipeline that reportedly the Prime Minister brought that up during his visit to the Oval Office last week. Would the revival of that project satisfy Albertans? Would that in itself be enough? Or is it just one of many pipelines that need to be considered?
Well, the challenge with Keystone XL is twofold. Number one is, again, you need a private proponent. And remember that the UCP government in Alberta wasted $1.5 billion of taxpayers' money on Keystone XL, which didn't come to fruition, and we lost every penny. The other challenge with Keystone XL is that while it is a pipeline to Tidewater, it does cross through the United States. So if our issue is to reduce our reliance on the US as a market, Keystone XL is only a partial solution to that. So I would say if that project somehow gets resurrected and moves forward, it is necessary but not sufficient.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. That's Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi.